Hello and welcome to the first video of the 4-voice counterpoint videos. This is going to be an introduction where we're going to go over some basic rules. And just like the theme on my channel, this first video is going to go over all of the rules in strict counterpoint. And then in my next videos, we're going to get into the actual species counterpoint for 4 voices, species 1 through 5. And then I will also be introducing 7th chords in that next video. And in this video, we will be looking at triads. This video is going to be pretty simple, but it's going to be a great introduction and just wrapping our heads around 4 voices and not being intimidated. After this, we're going to get into some more complex territories, and the end results will look and sound a lot more like actual contrapuntal music. Of course, then from all the lessons we learn in these videos, we're going to then want to find our own voice as a composer and be able to create melodies and just ideas for songs and pieces that then we can work out if we would like to use counterpoint for a certain section, and maybe for certain sections we won't even be thinking about counterpoint so much, but we will have this in our toolbox at any moment if we want to write a contrapuntal passage, or if we just want to write, let's say, one main melody and then another melody that you can also hear with that or accompanying that, and the counterpoint can help create that coherent second melody with that first melody. And of course, we're getting into 4 voice here, so now we're getting all into 4 coherent voices all at the same time. Of course, when you get into 4 voices, things get a little bit harder to keep track of. We start off with counterpoint with 2 voices, we go through the species, we get into 3 voices, we go through the species, and all that time it is pretty easy to follow all 3 voices. And now when we get here into 4 voices, for most people it's going to be harder to follow all these voices. For people that have an exceptionally good ear, it's not going to be as difficult for them, and they will not find so much trouble following all 4 voices. But that is not an average circumstance. Okay, but nonetheless, we're still going to want to follow good voice leading rules and still end up with a good product that is easy to follow. Here, when we get into 4 voices, it's going to be a lot easier to think about the bass voice as its own voice, and the 3 voices above that being the 3 voices above the bass voice. And of course, these are all 4 separate voices, but you can think about that separation between the bass and then the 3 voices above that, where the 3 voices above that might serve more melodically, might have certain interesting moments, and also moments of an accompaniment, while your bass voice can do all of that, but for the most part, it's going to be serving as a bass line. As we know, sometimes you have melodic bass lines and things like that, but for the most part, your upper voices are going to be more melodic. A lot of times your middle voices are rather boring as well, but it kind of depends on how crazy you want to go with different voices. And you can look at something like Bach's Art of the Fugue, and there you have 4 voices that are each coherent, and they almost have their own character each line, especially when the player is able to play in that way. If it's a piano, or if it's played by multiple players, then if each of those players puts their own character into that individual line, that really makes the difference. And then it is also written in a way that allows for that. Okay, we're going to look at this first example here. We're going to notice that we have complete triads in every measure. Like I said, for this first video, we're just going to stay very strict, so kind of just the very basic foundational rules. Every measure you see a 5/3 or 6/3 chord. The exception is the last measure, where a lot of times you have a tonic, and you have the tonic note tripled a lot of the times, which leaves either the 3rd or the 5th above the bass somewhere. And the reason why you end up tripling the tonic in the last measure a lot is because you're trying to follow contrary motion with all the voices, and sometimes that's what ends up happening. So since we have 4 voices, 3 of the voices are going to make a complete triad at all times. The 4th voice is going to double notes, or we're going to use a 7th chord, which will be for the next video, and in that case, then we're just going to have that extra note for the 7th chord. When composing strictly with triads using 4 voices, we will need to pay extra attention to parallel octaves now that every measure is going to have an octave. And that's when we're using these complete triads. We're only using triads for this example here. Since we're doubling a note in every measure, you're going to have octaves. And if you happen to double an octave in 2 voices, and then you double an octave in the same 2 voices in the next measure, then you're going to have parallel octaves there. The only way that you won't is if you repeat the same notes, then you're going to have oblique motion. But whatever you do, you need to be aware of that. Notice in the example above, the octaves never double between the same 2 voices twice in a row. This is very helpful for assuring that you don't have parallel octaves. You also need to check for parallel fifths, of course, as we see in measure 1 and measure 2 in the bass and tenor voice. We see 2 fifths in a row, but they're not moving in a parallel motion because they're staying in oblique motion, so this is perfectly fine. Now that we're using 4 voices, the standard figured bass is going to be less informative on what exact notes are above that bass note. Because of this, I'm going to show 2 methods which can be used either separately or together. Okay, so let's start simple. First, we see a triad here in root position. We have a simple 5-3 triad. The figured bass 5-3 is going to tell us that above the bass note we have a 3rd and a 5th. I know it's kind of ridiculous calling it a 5-3, reading it from the top down when we're building it from the bass up. That's the whole point. But a lot of people call it a 6-4 chord, so I think to not have confusion, I follow through with that and call it 6-3 chord, 6-4 chord, and 5-3 chord. I try to keep everything consistent in the way that I'm reading everything, and also follow along with how other people identify this too, so it doesn't lead to confusion when you're talking to other people. Now with this simple 5-3 triad, which is root position, we're going to think that we're in C major here. So if we're in C major here, we see C, E, G, which we know is the root position triad. But furthermore, we can think of each individual note, and that is that the root note is the tonic, the 3rd is the 3rd scale degree, and the 5th is the 5th scale degree. Okay, now if we go to the next example, we can build a 6-3 chord above scale degree 3, and that's going to use the same exact notes, or in other words, the same exact scale degrees as the 5-3 chord on the left. Because of this, these chords are going to sound very similar. Furthermore, we can build a 6-4 chord above scale degree 5, and this also contains the same exact notes. This might be kind of a funny way of looking at this because you're probably used to looking at this as root position, 1st inversion, and 2nd inversion. But it's good to know that historically, this is not always how people looked at these chords. In fact, in the times of Mozart and Beethoven, let's say, you can't find historical documents where they're talking about 1st inversion chords, 2nd inversion chords. That is just language that they didn't use. Furthermore, they did not use Roman numerals, but they were very proficient on basso continuo, and a lot of them also knew partimento, which goes along with improvising styles for writing music such as fugues or canons, and with things like rule of the octave. These things all tie into a way of structuring your music and using certain notes in certain ways that are going to be following the similar rules that we're going to be teaching here. And that's why the first time I showed it as these are different chords using the same notes, because there is actual historical documentation of Mozart showing one of his students. I can't remember exactly what that would be, but basically Mozart's saying, hey, all these chords share the same notes, and he was explaining that there was a significance to this, okay? But we also know that fourths are dissonances in counterpoint, and also the 4th in the 2nd inversion triad is above the bass note, so we see it shows up in the figured bass numbers. This is going to have to be treated properly when we're using strict counterpoint. So if you're being very strict, then the 2nd inversion triad just needs to be treated properly, approached properly, and resolved properly. But as we know from the first rule of 3-voice counterpoint, 4th intervals are allowed to be treated as consonant notes as long as they do not show up in the figured bass numbers. So in other words, if the 4ths occur in the upper voices and they're not built off that bass note, then they can be treated as an imperfect interval, so you don't have to approach it any specific way or treat it as a dissonance. And of course, this rule also transfers over here to 4 voices. And although the terminology was not the same, we need to realize that the ideas were pretty similar, and that's why musicologists use the terminology that they do still to this day. This aligns with the idea of fundamental bass described by Jean-Philippe Rameau in his treatise on harmony of 1722. Rameau's outlook aligns with mine, and that is that in all three of these chords, C is the root of the chord. So he may have not called it a root position, first inversion or second inversion, but he still looked at it in a similar way, and that is that the C is the harmonic root. So to explain that a little further, it's not the actual bass note, obviously. You see each of them have an actual different bass note, but the harmonic root of the chord is still C in all of these circumstances. The notes are just arranged in different orders, and that's why it's called an inversion. And furthermore, that's why this was known as fundamental bass, because that's the fundamental bass of the root position chord. Some keep their figured bass numbers the same no matter what order the notes above the bass are in. So even if you have a simple 5-3 triad, but instead your notes above the bass are scrambled in different orders. So instead, let's say it's the 5th above the bass and then the 3rd above that, you're still going to call it a 5-3 chord in a lot of people's eyes. There's nothing wrong with this. If this works for you, then this is the conventional approach. But it's also good to know that when you see final scores and you see people playing music, you're not going to see the figured bass. So the figured bass is a lot of times for the player, if you're going to be doing improvising, if you're going to be doing accompaniment. But in my channel, a lot of what I'm doing is for composing. So if you're a composer, you're probably going to be using figured bass as a way of identifying what's going on, and this is not going to show up in your final score. So instead of following everything strictly and having to keep everything in the same order, instead I find this very confusing, and I just label everything in the order above the bass note that it occurs. Okay, so the reason why I think it's confusing is because if we never end up actually changing the order of the numbers according to what notes they are above the bass note, then something like this will happen. Let's say I'm in C major and I have C as my bass note. If I put a 6-4 above that bass note, then I'll have the notes C, F, and A. Okay, that's a 6-4 chord above a C note in C major. But then if I flip those top two notes, instead of having C, F, A, if I have C, A, F, that's going to oftentimes be called still a 6-4 chord. But like I explained, a lot of times for a composer, you're just going to be using this as identifying your own score when you're writing your music. So in fact, instead of calling this a 6-4 chord, I would just call it a 4-6 chord, because when I see a C note on the bottom, and I can obviously read the notes above it, but if I label it, that's the whole point of it being efficient, I can see 6-4, CFA, and then I can see 4-6 CAF. And in my brain, that makes a lot more sense because I'm reading the order of the notes and I'm reading what notes occur above the bass note. And I know a lot of people won't recommend this, but if you're writing a score and, you are getting kind of stressed or your head's kind of hurting, it's going to be a lot of help if you actually label more things properly. So you might even go as far as labeling certain notes that you're going to be repeating in your chords now that you're going into 4 voices, and other things that might come to mind. Labeling can just be something that's very helpful when you're trying to keep track of what's going on in your score, how you're treating certain notes, and how you're voicing certain things, because that's also going to create the sound of the music at the moment. Okay, so that's why I do it this way. When I look at these 2 chords, I know that both of these 2 chords are going to function as second inversion chords, or what people call 6-4 chords, but I'm also going to be able to look at this quickly and see the order of the notes above the bass note. That's why this works out for me. In C major, we have 7 root position triads. If you're getting into counterpoint and here with 4 voices, you should really know this by now. If you need a refreshment of this, I have a video called Chords in a Major Key. But we can simply see we have the triads. So we can also keep in mind that each of these triads can be inverted. We can create our 6-3 or 6-4 chords out of these. And although Roman numerals are sort of a newer thing compared to maybe the style of the music, they're not all that new at all. They've been around for a very long time, and it's a very good way of keeping track of what chord you're using and what state it is in. I'm going to get into this more on the next page, but on the next page we're going to see what is written in Dorian. So we need to keep in mind that if we have our major scale here and we want to think about everything in Dorian, Then we can simply shift the notes according to the mode that we're working with. And since Dorian is the second mode of C major, then we see all we need to do is shift everything over one time, which also shows us each of the chords keep their same quality. We see the 2 now becomes a 1, it's still minor, and furthermore everything keeps the same quality. The 4 is now a 3, and that's major, and the 7th was diminished, but now our 6th is diminished in Dorian. Here we see an example in D Dorian by Thomas Atwood, who is a student of Mozart. We're first going to see his example and then the corrections that Mozart added to it. So we can see that we're not using figured bass anymore, we're using the Roman numerals, and this is making it a lot simpler. As we see, the root position triads are not labeled. And we simply see that the 6/3 chords are labeled as 6th chords, which can also be known as first inversion. The second inversion is labeled as 6/4, but since this is a strict counterpoint exercise, we don't see any 6/4 chords. So the reason why I explained my labeling of the figured bass before this is because of when you're composing, like I was saying, this can be a really good way of simplifying everything, just labeling the chord that you have in the key that you're using, and also it tells you right away the quality of that chord. It's super helpful. But then when things start to get kind of confusing, that is when you can start to use the figured bass and then just write certain numbers in so you know what notes are occurring above that bass note. All these little things can be helpful. But as we see here, we're completely not having to use the figured bass at all, and we're sort of tying the figured bass and the Roman numerals into one method of labeling. I also explain all this labeling and chord inversions in depth in my chord inversions and my 7th chord inversion videos. It explains all of the inversions and then the figured bass labeling that goes along with that in depth. So if you are a little bit unsure about that, or if you don't really know how this works, then watch that video and it'll help you out a lot. So the Roman numerals here tell us a lot. What does it tell us? It tells us the exact combination of notes, which are the scale degrees. It may not tell us the order that they're in, and that's where you might want to do the figured bass method that I was explaining before this. But what it also shows is the quality of the chord. This is if it's major, minor, augmented, or diminished. It also tells us if it's an inversion. If it's in root position, it's unlabeled. If it's an inversion, we see we have the 6. When you get into 7th chord inversions, those have their own labels. And to refresh on that, just check out my video called 7th chord inversions. The link will be in the description. Furthermore, Roman numerals can be labeled to accommodate for chromatic chords, such as the leading tone in the second to last measure in this example. We can see there is a raised leading tone, which can occur in Dorian. Not all modes can have a raised leading tone, because sometimes scale degree 7 is already a semitone away from the tonic, but in the case of Dorian, C natural is your 7th degree, and D is your 1st degree, so of course that is a full step away, and you can raise the C to a C sharp, and we can get our leading tone. We also see the last measure, what is known as a Picardy third, where you raise the third in a mode that normally is your tonic as a minor chord, and you raise that third, so now your tonic is a major chord, but normally in that mode, like I was saying, it would be minor. So that's where it's called a Picardy third. A lot of times you're going to see this in a song that is in minor, because your tonic chord is minor in your minor key. So then if that song ends on the tonic chord but the third is raised, it makes it that major third. This is the Picardy third, but here we see this is in Dorian. And Dorian is very similar to minor because natural minor is a flat 3, 6, and 7, and Dorian is a flat 3 and 7. Of course, a lot of times you're going to raise that flat and 7 for that leading tone, and then you only have a flat and third, but we can see the similarities and how close it is to the Aeolian scale or the natural minor scale. Okay, now we see Mozart's correction on Atwood's example. There were no major mistakes like parallel fifths or parallel octaves, but he improved the voice leading. Notice that Mozart changed each of the chords based off scale degree 7 from a first inversion to a root position. This does not simply have to do with the chord, but it has to do with the voice leading. Atwood decided to double the bass note in his original response, which is something that CPE Bach warns not to do. Bach did not explain why to not double the bass note, but I think it is simply because you do not want to drown out the sound of the bass note. It's very fundamental, and something like imperfect intervals are great at allowing you to not drown out the sound of the bass note, since you can hear both of the notes creating that interval very clearly. The octave is also the first overtone above a note, so doubling that note can drown out the lower sound of that same note. Most people in the current day will agree that the general consensus is that doubling the bass note is perfectly fine, except if it's 6/3 chords. And furthermore, you want to avoid doubling active scale degrees, such as tendency tones like the leading tone. Doubling tendency tones is going to result in parallel octaves, unless one of the voices moves in a different direction, which can sound unwanted, because a tendency tone has a tendency to resolve in a specific direction. And that is it for this video. It's pretty simple. It's just an introduction. I didn't want to go too much into it because it's almost like reviewing a bunch of stuff you probably already know. But now we can think and brainstorm on ideas of how we can actually label this, and this is going to be very important for us. From here, I'm going to show you two different examples. We have one in Mixolydian and one in Dorian. Feel free to fill these in if you want and practice your labeling, and maybe see if you want to use the Roman numerals or if you want to use the figured bass, or maybe you kind of want to use both in certain circumstances like I was explaining. But whatever it is, I'm still going to have my next video, which we're actually going to get into the species. We're going to have species 1 through 5 in 4 voices. But not only that, we're going to also include diatonic seventh chords, and we're also going to learn how to approach them and resolve them properly. And of course, that's going to be part 2 since this is part 1. Then I already have part 3 planned out, and that's where we're going to move on from the species approach and also the whole note cantus firmus, and we're going to be instead combining different species and also using a lot of florid counterpoint and free writing counterpoint. We're going to see a lot of good examples, and this is going to be examples from composers like Alan Belkin, so it's going to be some really good content in that video, and in all, it's going to be very informative. So be sure to look out for those videos, and also check out my other videos. I've posted a ton of videos on a bunch of different music topics. There's probably a good chance that if you go through my different playlists, you're going to find something that you're going to want to learn about. And I try my best to look at all the resources on the internet, whether that's reading articles and watching several YouTube videos. Whatever I can find, I try to put it all together in one video, and also double check things, make sure what other people are teaching is correct, and that's only what I'm going to be including in my video. I do try to disclude some stuff that I think may be kind of a waste of time, and I try to really boil it down to, okay, what's the important stuff here? So if you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe. I'm going to be posting a lot more stuff like this all the time. And if you enjoyed the video and you got something out of it, be sure to like it. And if you think you know someone else who's going to like it, then share with them. Maybe share it on social media. And until next time, take care and goodbye.